The clockmaker, whose timepieces ran backwards, Boston's temporal anomaly, 1887. At precisely 11:47 p.m. on December 3, 1887, Jeremiah Blackwood watched every clock in his State Street workshop strike midnight simultaneously, while their hands moved counterclockwise. For 6 months, every timepiece that emerged from his shop had developed the same impossible characteristic. They all ran backwards, yet somehow kept perfect time. Customers reported that their Blackwood clocks showed the correct hour only when viewed in mirrors, predicted future events by displaying them as past occurrences, and most disturbing of all, seemed to count down to moments that hadn't happened yet. The phenomenon had begun the day after Jeremiah purchased a peculiar collection of clockwork gears and springs from the estate of Dr. Ezekiel Thornburg, a Harvard professor who had died under mysterious circumstances while conducting experiments on what he called temporal mechanics. Jeremiah had been Boston's most respected clockmaker for 12 years, operating from a narrow shop wedged between a bookbinder and a lens grinder on State Street, near the bustling Faneuil Hall marketplace. His reputation was built on precision. Blackwood timepieces never gained or lost more than a few seconds per month, and his custom work adorned the mantles of Boston's wealthiest families. But since acquiring Dr. Thornburg's clockwork components, every mechanism he touched began behaving in ways that defied the fundamental laws of time itself. The mystery began in June 1887, when Jeremiah attended an estate auction at Dr. Thornburg's Beacon Hill mansion. The professor had been found dead in his study, surrounded by partially assembled clockwork devices and journals filled with mathematical equations that university colleagues couldn't decipher. The official cause of death was heart failure, but witnesses reported that the study's numerous clocks had all stopped at different times, as if time itself had become confused in that room. Most bidders at the auction avoided Dr. Thornburg's clockwork collection, perhaps unsettled by the circumstances of his death, or intimidated by the obviously sophisticated nature of his mechanical work. Jeremiah saw only an opportunity to acquire high-quality gears, springs, and escapements that would enhance his own craftsmanship. He purchased the entire collection for $12, a fraction of what the materials alone should have cost. The first sign of trouble appeared when Jeremiah installed one of Dr. Thornburg's gear assemblies into a grandfather clock commissioned by the widow Morrison. The mechanism functioned perfectly during assembly, with all components moving in proper sequence and the pendulum maintaining steady rhythm. But when Mrs. Morrison collected the clock 3 days later, she returned within hours claiming it was broken. The hands were moving backwards, yet it somehow showed the correct time. Jeremiah examined the clock carefully, confirming Mrs. Morrison's observation. The hour and minute hands rotated counterclockwise at exactly the speed they should move clockwise, creating the optical illusion that time was running in reverse. But when he calculated the displayed time based on the backwards motion, it was precisely accurate. The clock was keeping perfect time while appearing to run backwards. Initially, Jeremiah assumed he had made an error during assembly, perhaps installing a gear backwards or miscalibrating the escapement mechanism. He disassembled the entire clock, examined every component, and rebuilt it with meticulous attention to detail. But the rebuilt clock exhibited the same behavior, perfect accuracy displayed through backwards motion. The phenomenon spread to every timepiece Jeremiah worked on during the following weeks. Pocket watches, mantle clocks, and church tower mechanisms all began running counterclockwise after he incorporated Dr. Thornburg's components into their works. Customers initially assumed they were receiving defective merchandise, but careful observation revealed that the backwards running clocks kept more accurate time than conventional timepieces. Word of Jeremiah's backwards clock spread through Boston's social circles, attracting curiosity seekers and scientists who wanted to observe the temporal anomaly firsthand. Professor Augustus Mitchell from Harvard's Natural Philosophy Department spent several hours in Jeremiah's workshop, attempting to understand the mechanical principles that could cause such behavior. His conclusion was that the phenomenon was scientifically impossible, yet undeniably real. But the backwards motion was only the beginning of the clock's strange properties. Customers began reporting that their Blackwood timepieces seemed to anticipate future events, displaying times that corresponded to significant moments before they occurred. Mrs. Harrison's mantel clock had chimed 13 times the morning before she received news of her nephew's unexpected inheritance. Mr. Caldwell's pocket watch had stopped at 3:17 p.m. 2 days before he learned that his business partner had died at precisely that time. Before I continue with the revelation that would change everything about how Boston understood time itself, I need to know you're ready for this journey into temporal impossibility. If you've ever experienced a moment where time seemed to slow down or speed up during a crucial event, write time bends in the comments along with your city. Subscribe now, because what Jeremiah discovered about Dr. Thornburg's experiments will shatter everything you thought you knew about the nature of time and memory. Jeremiah's investigation into Dr. Thornburg's background led him to the Harvard University Library, where he spent his evenings reading the professor's published papers on temporal mechanics and chronological theory. Dr. Thornburg had been a mathematician and natural philosopher who believed that time was not a constant force flowing in one direction, but rather a malleable dimension that could be manipulated through precise mechanical calculations. The professor's research had focused on the relationship between mechanical motion and temporal perception, based on his theory that clockwork mechanisms could be designed to interact with what he called chronological fields, invisible forces that governed the flow of time in specific locations. Dr. Thornburg believed that certain combinations of gears, springs, and pendulums could create resonance patterns that would allow mechanical devices to perceive and respond to temporal fluctuations. But Dr. Thornburg's most controversial theory involved what he termed retrocausal clockwork, mechanisms that could detect future events by observing their effects on present-moment temporal fields. He believed that significant future occurrences created temporal shadows that could be detected by sufficiently sensitive mechanical instruments, allowing properly designed clocks to predict coming events by measuring disturbances in the flow of time. Jeremiah discovered that Dr. Thornburg had spent the final years of his life attempting to construct clockwork devices that could prove his temporal theories. The gear assemblies and escapement mechanisms that Jeremiah had purchased were prototypes designed to detect and respond to chronological field fluctuations. Thornburg had been on the verge of completing a master timepiece that would demonstrate the reality of temporal manipulation when he died under mysterious circumstances. The professor's personal journal, which Jeremiah obtained from Dr. Thornburg's former research assistant, revealed that the temporal experiments had been producing increasingly dramatic results in the months before his death. Prototype clocks had begun displaying not just backwards motion, but complex temporal behaviors that suggested they were operating according to entirely different physical laws than conventional timepieces. More disturbing, Dr. Thornburg's final journal entries indicated that his temporal experiments had attracted the attention of entities or forces that existed outside normal time flow. The professor wrote about temporal observers who seemed to be monitoring his research, and chronological interference that suggested someone or something was attempting to prevent his experiments from succeeding. Dr. Thornburg's death had occurred on the same day he planned to demonstrate his completed temporal clockwork to colleagues from Harvard's Natural Philosophy Department. According to his journal, the master timepiece had achieved full temporal resonance, allowing it to detect and display future events with perfect accuracy. But the demonstration never took place because Dr. Thornburg was found dead hours before his colleagues arrived. The circumstances of the professor's death became more suspicious when Jeremiah learned that all of Dr. Thornburg's temporal clockwork had stopped functioning immediately after his death, as if his life force had been somehow connected to their operation. The mechanisms remained mechanically sound, but they no longer exhibited any temporal anomalies until Jeremiah began incorporating them into his own clockwork constructions. This discovery led Jeremiah to realize that his backwards clocks weren't simply malfunctioning timepieces, they were continuation of Dr. Thornburg's temporal experiments. By unknowingly combining the professor's prototype components with his own clockmaking expertise, Jeremiah had completed research that Dr. Thornburg had died trying to finish. But Jeremiah's continuation of the temporal experiments began attracting the same attention that had apparently led to Dr. Thornburg's death. Strange men in dark coats began observing his workshop from across State Street, always disappearing when Jeremiah attempted to approach them. His mail was clearly being intercepted and read before delivery, and several customers reported being questioned about their Blackwood clocks by individuals who identified themselves as government officials. The situation became urgent when Jeremiah discovered that his backwards clocks weren't just predicting future events, they were beginning to influence them. Mrs. Patterson's mantel clock had displayed a specific time repeatedly for several days before her husband announced his decision to sell their house and move to California. At precisely that moment, Mr. Weber's pocket watch had chimed at unusual intervals that perfectly matched the rhythm of his heartbeat during a heart attack that occurred exactly when the watch had been predicting. Jeremiah realized that Dr. Thornburg's temporal clockwork wasn't just observing chronological fields, it was actively manipulating them. The backwards running timepieces were creating temporal disturbances that influenced the flow of cause and effect in their vicinity. People who owned Blackwood clocks were experiencing lives that unfolded according to temporal patterns determined by mechanical calculations rather than natural causation. But the most disturbing discovery came when Jeremiah examined his own behavior over the previous 6 months. He had been unconsciously following daily routines that perfectly synchronized with the temporal patterns displayed by his workshop clocks. His decisions about which projects to complete, which customers to serve, and even when to eat meals had all been unconsciously guided by temporal cues from Dr. Thornburg's clockwork. This led to the horrifying realization that Jeremiah was no longer living according to natural time flow. He had become a component in Dr. Thornburg's temporal mechanism, his life and decisions controlled by clockwork calculations designed to achieve purposes he didn't understand. The professor's death hadn't ended his temporal experiments. It had simply transferred control of the research to an unwitting successor. The true scope of Dr. Thornburg's temporal manipulation became clear when Jeremiah discovered that the backwards clocks were all synchronized to a master timeline that predicted a specific future event scheduled for January 15th, 1888. All of the temporal anomalies, predictive displays, and behavioral influences were apparently designed to ensure that this particular future occurrence would happen exactly as Dr. Thornburg had calculated, but Jeremiah couldn't determine what event was supposed to occur on January 15th, or why Dr. Thornburg had considered it important enough to justify manipulating time itself. The backwards clocks provided temporal cues, but no explanation of their ultimate purpose. Jeremiah was participating in a vast temporal conspiracy without understanding its goals or consequences. The mystery deepened when Jeremiah realized that he wasn't the only person in Boston whose life was being influenced by temporal manipulation. The customers who owned backwards clocks were all connected through a network of relationships, business partnerships, and social interactions that formed a complex pattern designed to coordinate their actions toward the January 15th event. Mrs. Morrison's social circle included several other Blackwood clock owners, and their synchronized temporal influences were orchestrating a series of dinner parties, business meetings, and casual encounters that would place specific people in specific locations at calculated times. Caldwell's business activities were being guided to ensure particular financial transactions occurred according to predetermined schedules. The entire pattern suggested that Dr. Thornburg had designed a temporal machine that used human beings as components. But the most frightening aspect of the temporal manipulation was that it seemed to be working. The backwards clocks were successfully coordinating complex chains of cause and effect across Boston's social and economic networks, proving that Dr. Thornburg's theories about temporal mechanics were not just scientifically accurate, but practically applicable on a massive scale. Jeremiah faced a moral dilemma that had no precedent in human experience. He could continue participating in Dr. Thornburg's temporal experiment, allowing the January 15th event to occur as calculated, or he could attempt to disrupt the temporal manipulation by destroying the backwards clocks and freeing their owners from chronological control. But disrupting the temporal experiment would have unknown consequences for everyone whose lives had been influenced by the backwards clocks. 6 months of temporally guided decisions and relationships had created a complex web of interdependencies that might collapse catastrophically if the temporal manipulation suddenly ended. Jeremiah might save people from chronological control, only to destroy their lives in more conventional ways. The decision became urgent when Jeremiah discovered evidence that the January 15th event involved more than just the coordination of Boston residents' activities. Dr. Thornburg's temporal calculations had been designed to prevent a specific catastrophe that would otherwise occur on that date, a disaster that would claim hundreds of lives unless the temporal manipulation succeeded in altering the chain of causation that led to it. This revelation forced Jeremiah to understand that Dr. Thornburg's temporal experiments weren't about proving scientific theories or demonstrating technological capabilities. They were about using clockwork mechanisms to save lives by manipulating the flow of cause and effect in ways that would prevent foreseeable tragedies from occurring. But the temporal manipulation required sacrificing the free will of everyone involved in the experiment. The people whose lives were being guided by backwards clocks were no longer making genuine choices about their actions. They were following behavioral patterns calculated to serve Dr. Thornburg's disaster prevention goals regardless of their personal interests or desires. Jeremiah realized that he had to choose between allowing a catastrophe that would kill hundreds of people or continuing a temporal manipulation that violated the fundamental human right to make free choices about one's own life. Either option involved sacrificing important values to preserve others, with consequences that would affect not just the immediate participants, but the nature of human existence itself. The choice became more complex when Jeremiah discovered that Dr. Thornburg's temporal experiments were part of a larger pattern of chronological manipulation that had been operating throughout human history. The professor's research had revealed evidence that significant historical events had been influenced by temporal interventions designed to prevent even greater catastrophes from occurring. This suggested that human history itself might be the product of ongoing temporal manipulation by individuals or organizations with the knowledge and technology needed to detect and prevent chronological disasters. Free will and natural causation might be illusions maintained by temporal engineers who guided human development while keeping their interventions hidden from conscious awareness. But the most disturbing implication was that Dr. Thornburg's death might have been caused by competing temporal manipulators who disagreed with his disaster prevention goals. The strange men observing Jeremiah's workshop might represent chronological factions fighting a hidden war over the right to control human history through temporal intervention. This possibility transformed Jeremiah's moral dilemma into a strategic decision with implications far beyond the January 15th event. His choice about whether to continue or disrupt Dr. Thornburg's temporal experiment might determine which faction of temporal manipulators gained control over Boston's chronological future, and by extension, the development of human civilization itself. The final revelation came when Jeremiah discovered that the January 15th catastrophe was supposed to be the collapse of the Pemberton mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts, an industrial disaster that would kill 88 workers and injure hundreds more. Dr. Thornburg's temporal manipulation was designed to coordinate a series of seemingly unrelated events that would delay the mill's operation just long enough to prevent the building collapse that would otherwise occur. This discovery confirmed that Dr. Thornburg's temporal experiments were fundamentally humanitarian in purpose, designed to save lives rather than advance scientific knowledge or personal power. But it also revealed that the professor had been willing to manipulate hundreds of people's lives without their consent, in order to prevent a disaster they would never know had been avoided. Jeremiah's final decision was influenced by his realization that the temporal manipulation had already succeeded in ways that couldn't be undone. The backwards clocks had orchestrated 6 months of coordinated human activity that had established relationships, business partnerships, and social networks that would persist even if the chronological control ended. Dr. Thornburg's temporal intervention had already changed the course of human development in Boston. On January 14, 1888, Jeremiah made his choice. He allowed Dr. Thornburg's temporal experiment to continue, coordinating the final day of chronological manipulation that would prevent the Pemberton mill disaster. The backwards clocks guided their owners through a complex series of seemingly routine activities that resulted in the mill's closure for routine maintenance. On January 15th, exactly the delay needed to prevent the building collapse. The disaster that never happened validated Dr. Thornburg's temporal theories while raising profound questions about the ethics of preventing catastrophes through chronological manipulation. Jeremiah had participated in saving 88 lives by sacrificing the free will of hundreds of people who would never know their choices had been controlled to serve humanitarian goals. But the success of the temporal experiment also confirmed that human history was subject to manipulation by individuals with sufficient knowledge of chronological mechanics. The backwards clocks proved that time itself could be treated as a natural resource to be managed and directed according to human purposes, regardless of the philosophical implications for concepts like fate, destiny, and personal agency. Jeremiah continued operating his clockmaking business until his death in 1923, but he never again incorporated Dr. Thornburg's components into his timepieces. The backwards clocks gradually returned to normal operation as their temporal programming completed the prevention of the Pemberton mill disaster, leaving no evidence of the chronological manipulation except Jeremiah's private records and memories. The Pemberton mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts never experienced the catastrophic collapse that Dr. Thornburg's temporal calculations had predicted. The building continued operating safely for several more years before being demolished and replaced with modern construction. The 88 workers who would have died in the January 15th disaster lived full lives, never knowing that their survival had been purchased through the sacrifice of other people's temporal autonomy. Modern historians studying the industrial development of 19th century New England have noted several anomalous patterns in the timing of business decisions, social events, and personal relationships that occurred in Boston during late 1887 and early 1888. These patterns suggest coordinated activity that defies statistical probability, but no conventional explanation has been proposed for the synchronized behavior of hundreds of apparently unconnected individuals. The case of Dr. Thornburg's temporal experiments remains one of the most sophisticated examples of chronological manipulation in recorded history, demonstrating both the potential benefits and ethical dangers of treating time as a controllable dimension rather than an immutable natural force. The backwards clocks proved that temporal mechanics could be used to prevent disasters and save lives, but only at the cost of violating the fundamental human right to make free choices about one's own existence. If this story has made you more aware of the complex relationships between personal choice, historical causation, and the prevention of catastrophic events, please share it with others who might appreciate these philosophical implications. Subscribe for more historical cases where individual discoveries revealed hidden forces that shape human development in ways most people never recognize or understand. Before you go, take a moment to consider how many of your daily decisions are truly free choices, and how many might be influenced by forces you don't recognize. Are there patterns in your life that seem too coordinated to be coincidental? Jeremiah Blackwood's experience with temporal manipulation reminds us that the line between free will and guided behavior might be more blurred than we typically assume. Remember, Jeremiah's most important insight wasn't about clockmaking techniques or temporal theory, Niti 8. It was about the moral complexity of preventing disasters through means that violate individual autonomy. In our modern world, where prediction algorithms and behavioral analysis can influence human decisions in subtle but powerful ways, his experience with backwards clocks remains a relevant cautionary tale about the ethics of controlling behavior for beneficial purposes. Next week we'll explore another case where someone discovered that seemingly random events were actually coordinated by hidden forces working to achieve specific historical outcomes. Until then, remember that the most important choices you make might be the ones where you resist influences you can't immediately identify, and that protecting human freedom sometimes requires accepting risks that careful planning could eliminate.